Hey guys, this is going to be a little bit different from my usual videos, but I want to start delving into how to use p5js to make anything that you want, really. And to get started with that, I'm going to show you what this looks like and how to use it. And so the first part of that is you have your coding section. This is where your code goes in this area. And there's this little arrow right here, which flips open, and you can see the files that are associated with it. And this is pretty standard stuff for any JavaScript. You're going to have a web page, the HTML itself, and really all this is just some libraries being pulled in for P5, and we don't have to worry about those. They're just going to be there for us to use. A basic style sheet, and then inside of the body they are putting the script file in there as script to be compiled. And that's this file that we were just in right here. So this is our main script, and then there's just the style sheet, which we don't really have to do anything with. So right here we're going to be mainly working in Sketch.js. We can close this up, and then on the right here it's showing a preview of what we have. And so real quickly I'll show you what this does. We hit the play button, and you can see that we get a square that's almost white, and that's because this is creating a canvas object of 400 by 400 pixels. That's the size of the square. So this would be the width, and this would be the height, and then we're filling that square with this 220 gray scale. Grayscale being from 0 to 255, 0 being black and 255 being white. So you can see it's pretty close to white. If we were to take this down to like 120, we would then play it again and see that this is much darker gray. And then, basic setup here, setup and draw really, is this is part of the p5js library, is that there's these functions that are kind of part of the event loop, or so you would kind of call it. So setup is what happens one time at the very beginning when you load or play this button here. And so it's setting up by creating that canvas object, and we'll get into what objects and everything are real quick, because this first video is really about getting comfortable with JavaScript, the basics of JavaScript, and in the context of p5js. So you have the setup, which runs once at the very beginning. So if you have something you don't want to do over and over again, this is kind of where you can do it. But you can also do things one time outside of setup up here. So if I wanted to say make a variable or a constant, these are just memory locations storing data. So I can have a variable called x, and I can make that equal to 0, the number 0. And you do not actually need these semicolons most of the time. So I can actually take those out, I can put white space in, it's not going to really hurt anything in this case. I can add extra lines in here. All of that's great. I'll even put more lines in between this stuff, kind of make it clear what's distinct from each other. So all of that will still work. We're not using this x equals 0 at all, but we could put it in there. Maybe I wanted to have it be, a W for width, and we'll make this, 600. And you can also do a comma and define another variable right there. So we could have that be the, the same 400. Then what we can do is say W here and H here, and then it kind of becomes more clear what this is, and we can update that up here, or maybe work with those numbers in some way before using them in this create canvas function. So if I do that, then it becomes wider. You can see that. And the other thing you can do in your code is put comments. So one really basic kind of comment that it's just personal preference, but I like to put the name of the function at the end, just so we can kind of label this curly bracket here, you can see how they highlight. Everything inside of these curly brackets becomes the body of the setup function. It is what's being set up. All of this code inside of here. So you might end up with a bunch of these curly brackets for different things over time, so that's why I kind of like to label them whenever it's possible, or doesn't get too busy, too much going on. So there, that's kind of where we're at. Aside from the actual basic JavaScript, which I will go into, I just want to point out that there is a couple of things up here you can do. The help menu has a helpful reference. If you click that, it'll open up in a new tab. This reference page shows all of the things that you can do in the core library. There's also like extra libraries that people have made over time, and you can go into those. There's also tutorials and stuff in there if you want to use those. But and they have kind of like categories of things that you can jump to here. So if I wanted to go to transform, it would pop me down to this transform section with all these different rotates, shears, translates, all of that. So that's all part of this long list. And so if we wanted to look up something, let's say I want to understand how that create canvas works, I just start typing it and it should show up. And you just highlight it down there and hit enter. And now we can see create canvas. They've got an example here, 100 by 50, this one. And then they've filled it with 153. They've actually done it in the setup, which you can do. It won't refill the background every frame that way. And then they put a line from the top left corner, 0, 0. So they're kind of exploring the idea of your origin is the top left, and then as you increase Y, you go down. As you increase X, you go to the right. So width and height being 150, these guys right here just pointing to what you used here, that being 100 positive going down and 100 positive going to the right and 50 positive going down. So that's your coordinate system. And then they talk a bit more about it down here. You can make more canvases if you want to, and they would all go into the page. You can also, there's this idea of a renderer, which we don't really need to get into, but that offers different capabilities if you use the WebGL renderer. Usually that's for like 3D stuff, I believe. So yeah, and then you can search from any page and it'll work. The other thing we saw was the background, so we'll take a look at that. Background. So we did something similar to this where we put a grayscale in it. 51 is a pretty dark gray. So it looks almost black on this white background, but it is a gray. And then they have RGB values that you can use. So red, green, and blue. So all red, 255 full red, most of the way up on green, and 0 blue makes this yellow color. And so you would, if you're not sure how these work together, you don't have an intuition for that, check out Photoshop, or if you don't have Photoshop, you can go to photopeia.com. And this is basically Photoshop on the web. So if you opened up a new document of some sort, and you went to your colors, in this color tab right here, I'm not going to introduce like all of the features of Photopeia or Photoshop, so you might need to be a little bit familiar or just kind of follow along here. But as you shift around, you can see the yellow is that RGB value, so it's pretty similar to what we saw. And then you can see if we go to green, it's 255.00, so it's full green is right there. If we go to red, that's going to be all the way down at the bottom. That's the red, and kind of like orangey is a little bit more green added in. So yellow is like full green and full red, and then cyan is full green and full blue, and magenta is full red and full blue. So that's how your color combinations work with RGB, if you ever want to use that. Kind of that basis of knowledge there. And then there's also other options, like if you wanted to go with hue, saturation, brightness, that would be, if I go back into the colors, kind of think of this bar here as your hue, right? As I move up and down, you can see this H for hue, shifting, and nothing else is changing. So our color is staying in this kind of position, this like lighter, unsaturated position, right? It's only 38% saturation, which means it's not very far to the right here. And the brightness is pretty high. It's almost all the way up from the black. So that's how hue, saturation, and brightness work. And the way that we access that kind of method is with this color mode right here. So you can set color mode to that way if you like thinking about your colors in that direction. And they also have some named ones. You know, you're kind of limited there, but you can use red, white, black, whatever. And also hexadecimal, if you're familiar with those in web development, you can use hexes. There's also the capability to just type in a string, RGB, and then whatever values, or you can, and the most important part about that is you can do RGBA, which adds this transparency for the fourth value. So this one is basically only a quarter filled with that green color. That's why it looks a little more pale from this one, because the white from behind is showing through. All right, that's all about I'm going to show on this. Kind of gone a little too far with the colors there, but the basics of JavaScript are that you can define variables with names. This can be, you know, any kind of name that you like. Usually more descriptive is better. The H and the W are a little bit short, right? They could be used for something else, and also you could end up maybe having W used in two different places and not know it. So it's better to have these longer names sometimes. And then this is a number value, and a number value is a, you know, just it can be under the hood. It's going to be the 0, 600 with like a bunch of decimal points, but it'll display it as 600. And then let's see, what else? We've got strings. So if I had my string, the way you can do strings is either with double quotes, and you can just put things inside of that. So the usual one is hello world, right? So that's your string there. If you want to put a quote inside of a quote, you have to escape it. And the way you do that was with the slash there. That's the one below your backspace key. And then you put the quote after that slash. And then I'll do it again over here. And what we'll do is show these values, right? So there's a way to see these values down in your console as opposed to over here. So, and that's with this console.log function. And inside of these parentheses after log, we will put the thing that we want. So if I just put H in there, valid expected token. We didn't finish this. Okay, yeah. So sometimes it can will. So if I like, I think what happened there was I have these quotes, and see, like, it likes to try and help you out by putting extra quotes in there. And if I do the slash quote, you see it didn't actually put a second quote in there. So now what we ended up with is this opening quote here, but no real closing quote because this one is escaped out. So I needed to put a second one in. It's kind of annoying that it does that, but it does. Anyway, now that we fixed that, we were logging the H value, and we did get the 400 from H, which is set up here. So that's kind of a sanity check. The other thing you can do with this console logging, if you're doing a bunch of logging, is put, and this is another way to do quotes, is just with a single, like the single quote and the same key without the shift, and then you can maybe put a colon in there and a space, and then the way you join a quote, a string with a value, some other value like the H value, is with that plus symbol. Or at least that's one easy way to do it. So now if I log, we can see that it's calling It's saying h is 400, which is helpful, right? Because then I can do w, and I can see both of those values and know which one is which. So this is known as type coercion, because what we're doing here is showing a string, really, when we do console log. And so this string here, when you add it to another string, or to any other value, that value gets coerced into becoming a part of a string so that it can then be joined with this string. So since we're not using it after this point, it's great. But if we were ever to, like, say h is equal to h string plus h, right? And then I will comment this out, just so we're not running that. But yeah, now we've changed the value of h. So it was 400, and now it's h colon space, and then string of 400. And so even if I was to take, well, let's just do this. We'll do a console log h type of, I think it's type of first, type of h, and we run that, we can see that it returned a string here. So now h is no longer a number that we can add to, right? So if I was going to try to say h plus 1, h equals h plus 1, and then log what h is, you can see that we got a different value than we expected, right? 4001 is not the 401 that we were expecting, because it's been turned into a string already. So we're just concatenating that one as a string onto the end of it. So that's something to consider when you're putting things together like that. Try to keep, and generally you want to try to keep the number values as number values. And if you're ever putting things together like this, you don't want to use them further on down in your code. So it will confuse things. But let's do the string here, right? So my string, and we'll unquote that, or uncomment that. And the way that I'm commenting is with control or command and the question mark key, which has the forward slash on it. So that does the whole line, or if you have a certain section, actually it's the whole line anyway. So then you can see that we've got those quotes as we would expect. If I just tried it without the escapes on this one, what ends up happening is the string ends up stopping there, and then it has what it thinks would probably be like a variable name. So it's getting confused because it doesn't see this as part of the string. That's why you have to have the escapes. And the coloration is helpful in that regard, and also like the messaging that pops up. So there's some other types of data. There's something called a Boolean, and that's just a true or false. So I'll make bool as my Boolean, or we can say my Boolean here. And then that's going to be either true or it's going to be false. And really these are the same as 1 and 0 under the hood, just the numbers 1 and 0. Because a 1 is something, and therefore that in JavaScript, something is true if it exists, and it's false if it doesn't, really. That's kind of the idea. So if I put a 0 in there, that would be the same as false. But false is a little bit more readable in terms of what we're expecting in human language. So it's kind of better to go with the true and false when you can. And then obviously if we put my Boolean in here in the console log, then we would get that same false, right? Here we are. Now there's a way to change the value to swap it if it is true to go to false and false to go back to true. And that's with the not symbol, which is the exclamation point. And you can put a space in between if you want. And now when we log it here, we're getting true because my Boolean contains a true, the opposite of false. And you can do this as many times as you want, but there's really no point in doing it twice, right? Because you get back to the way that it was. And what is kind of interesting is that you can coerce a value into being a Boolean. So here's my Boolean object, right? And then we can put our value inside of these parentheses and get a true or a false based on what we had. So if I put my string in there, what we're going to get is a true, because that string is something. Now if I had put a different string in there, like an empty string, that actually shows up as false. So JavaScript is coercing that string because it's zero length, there's nothing in there. It's saying you probably want that to be false, and so we're going to call it a false Boolean. Similarly with numbers, I already said 1 is true, right? So is anything over 0. So we can even go 0.001, and that will still be true. But if we go 0.00 all the way down, then it becomes false. And similarly, negative numbers actually are also true. So anything but 0 is true in a Boolean. Good to know, right? Now, what else do we want to see? There's Boolean strings, numbers, and there's also kind of more complex values that are, let's go with the simplest one, is like a list of different numbers or characters or whatever. Characters in JavaScript are the same as strings, except, it'd be just one of these. So you could literally just do H, and that would be it. A lot of times people like to use the single quotes for characters and the double quotes for full strings of like multiple characters, but it really doesn't matter in JavaScript. It's just a nomenclature people use. So what do we do with a list of these things? We create something called an array. So my array, and again, you can call these anything you want. Usually you want to call it something in relation to what it's being used for, how it's being used. If you had an array of like colors, you'd say, colors for something, right? If it was colors for different circles that you're drawing on the screen, you'd say like circle colors, and then you could have a list of those. And this is generally the naming convention, is to start with lowercase for a variable or a function, and then camel case by uppercasing the first letter of each word without any spaces. You can't put spaces because it's going to think that this is your variable name and this is not part of it. You can put underscores, but we generally don't do that because underscores are used often like this to say this is a variable that we're not going to use anywhere else, and therefore we don't really care. And even sometimes you see like a throwaway variable, which isn't a great practice, but you can do like this, and that's technically a variable name that you can use. Undo a couple times here. So my array, the way we define this, just like any other variable, we put the assignment equals, and then we go with the square brackets, like this. I'll put spaces in them. It's up to you if you do or not. And then we start listing things with comma separators. So I could put a 1, a 2, and a 3 in there, and then that's our list of 3 numbers. But you can also just leave it like this as an empty array, and that's perfectly fine. So there's a lot of things you can do with arrays. I'm going to go to the base JavaScript stuff, so let's do W3 schools. this is kind of, the area where you actually can look up these JavaScript like types of data points and different ways to work with them. So you can see we went over the string and the number. There's all sorts of other ones in here. We did Boolean as well, and we're doing array now. So we can click on that. You can see they're doing something similar here, but they're using strings inside. The semicolons, you will see those in some situations. There's going to be like strict mode for JavaScript, and you will need the semicolons in that case. But in p5js, you won't need them in most cases. Sometimes you do if you are saying like return and it's expecting a value at the end. You can put a semicolon and say just return without a value, something like that. But other than that kind of situation, you generally don't need them. What the semicolon means is that it's the end of the statement, right? So this is saying, okay, I've done this. Now I'm not going to do anything else with that. You can stop working with this variable. And so technically, it allows you to put another, like variable assignment right after this that could be of some other type. But generally, you want to put each variable, at least if you're assigning them like this, on a separate line, just to make it more readable. So it's not really necessary to have that. So down here, what we're seeing is a bunch of methods. Because an array is an object, and an object is basically the core building block of JavaScript. Almost every single thing in the language is considered an object. And so an object is just this block of code in curly braces, just like these, but these are functions. However, you can define an object with the class function, and you can give it a name. And when we're defining an object, we actually start with a capital. That kind of helps differentiate them when you see the names, right? And then it has the curly braces. So everything inside of these curly braces is my object. Defines what it is to be that object. And so technically, each one needs a constructor. A constructor is what happens when you call this object, and this one's like here, the Boolean, right? So when you call the object like this with the parentheses, you then put values inside of here. These are called arguments or parameters. And so you would have the same thing here. You can put some kind of argument in there, and then you put the curly braces again inside of the object. So then this is the end of your constructor. My object constructor. So then you start doing things in here. So like if I was going to pass a name to this, right, then I could have this object that we're defining store that name inside of it, and then we can grab the name. And we do that similar to what we saw with the console log. So with console log, we were doing something like this, right? And we were putting like my string in there. You see this dot notation right here. We're saying console.log, and that's the object of the console containing the method log inside of it. And so we're accessing inside of console the log method. And so it's like this nesting doll thing where you can have console contains log, and then maybe the log contains something else, maybe it had a transcript or something like that. Obviously that's not going to be something that's defined already, but if it was defined, that's how you would get to it. You would get to it inside of log, inside of console. And that way you can kind of dig down deeper and deeper into these structures of information data capabilities. So in my object, if we're putting the name to it, the way we assign to that object is with the word this. You can see it turns yellow. It's a reserved word, just like class and function. It means something special, so you can't use it for like a variable name or something. And then we go this dot, meaning inside of this put something called a name, and then we just pass in the just name, which is up here, and that gets stored inside. And another thing you might do in this case is make sure that name is a string, right? So you can just say string and put parentheses around it. And then whatever they put in here, even if it's like a number, this will turn that number into a string for you. And then whenever you access name, you know that it's a string. So then if you're doing like something plus name to append it on, you're going to be sure that it's not going to actually add numbers together and give you like, 1 plus 1 equals 2 instead of 1 plus 1 equals, the two characters 1, meaning like 11, right? If that's what you wanted to do. So inside of my object, there's also plenty of room to do other things. You can obviously, pass in as many things as you want in here. So like we put H and W in here. You can just put commas in here. You can say, H and W. And then similarly, you can say this dot H equals H. And maybe have that be a number, right? Now if they put in a string and it gets coerced into a number, it's probably going to be not a number. This value right here. See how it turns pink? That's a actual value that says you passed something in that was supposed to become a number, but there's no way to turn it into a number. So we give you this weird nan value instead. So the way you could just make sure that that's some kind of number in case they give you something weird there is to say or. And that's these two pipes. That's the shift plus the character underneath the backspace. This is the logical or, which means, hey, give me this number, and if this number is not evaluating to true, which nan, let's do nan actually. Well, I'll just tell you, nan as a Boolean evaluates to false. But so does 0, right? So what if they put 0 in here? Well, then it would go to whatever we put over here instead. Let's say we wanted 100 to be the base, like the default value, if they had an H. So number, and they pass a 0, you get get 100. And maybe that's what you want to happen. But they could also pass like a negative, right? So the other thing you can do is make sure that this is positive with the absolute value. Absolute value just changes any negatives to a positive. That's all it really does. And so there's a way to nest this. And so it's getting kind of long, but what you can do is use the math object. And we saw that back in the object reference here. And we'll get back to arrays, but math. And math has all of these values in here for you so that you don't have to make them from scratch. Exponentials, logarithmic stuff, all that sort of thing, the rounding. Up at the top here, you can see ABS for absolute value. That's how that works. So we're just going to use the math.abs. And again, this is an object and it has that ABS method inside of it that we're then using. And so I have, let's strategically take the space out of here so we can say, okay, we've got number H, and then we're getting the absolute value of that number. So it needs to be a number for us to get the absolute value of it. And if that does not evaluate to a positive number above 0, then we're going to put 100. So if they give you 0 or some other weird thing, you're going to get 100. If it they give you a negative number, you're going to get the positive version of that. So that's a kind of a way to prevent bad data from going in, which is something you always have to kind of contend with. It's kind of the annoying part of coding, but it is a part of it. So let's go back to lists real quick. We have this empty array. Inside of that array is as much space as we want to put any kind of values. So we can put numbers, we can put strings, we can put other objects, we can put other arrays. And so if I wanted to define an object like this and put it into the array, I can do that. I can either do it inside of here, like new my object, and then quotes, and then we say like maybe object 1 or A maybe, and then we'll give it like, 200, 300. So that's not only creating a new instance, is called, of this object with these values inside of it. Let's put the W in there. There we go. But it's also putting that instance inside of a list. So then, you could technically put a comma and do some other type of value, like hi there, some string, right? Or you could put numbers or any kind of, Boolean or anything in there. Even another one of these objects. But it gets kind of long, right? You don't want your lines to go too long because it's hard to see what's going on to the right here. So what we like to do instead, sometimes, it depends on the style that you're going for, but you can then say my array. You can either push to it, so my array.push, and you can add things to your array like that. Technically, also array, you can put commas and push multiple things, just like you would do here. If I had a variable named ASDF, then that would work. But you can also do multiple push commands, and now I have 3 objects inside of this list. So then I can say, console log my array. Let's see what we did wrong. Usually we did something wrong before initialization. So used before the declaration. Does it have to be? That's kind of weird. Let's put B in here and C in here. My object class should be okay. I don't think it needs a method yet. What I'm going to do is put this up here. I don't think this is necessary, but I'm just going to exclude this option from being a problem. It seems to be okay. I guess it does have to be defined before you use it here. I would have thought it would get pulled up to the top, but it doesn't. A lot of times in the compiler, this stuff gets pulled to the top, but I think that only happens with functions, maybe? Kind of interesting. Anyway, so we can put it at the top. It's kind of annoying up there, right? It's kind of getting in the way of our code. So we have the option to pull this out if we want. So the way we can do that, let's go open our files, open here, and make a new file. Say my object.js. Add that file. You can see it over here now. We're going to put that code in here. Go back to our JS and remove it from there. And there's one last thing we need to do to make that work, which is go into our HTML file and make sure that script is also getting put in. So I'm just going to use handy code, or handy tip here is to Control Command Shift and D, and that will duplicate the current line, or if you had a certain amount of text selected, it'll duplicate just that amount of text. And then we want to put the first thing to get loaded as this myObject.js. There we go. And now when we run it, we should still get this myObject because it's being defined before we start running our other code. But inside of here, we don't have to worry about it anymore, which is great. So you notice I'm not doing too much over here yet. We're mostly focusing on JavaScript. So in the next video I'm going to do, we'll go into more about how we actually make cool stuff happen over here, because there's quite a lot we can do. But I wanted to point out our list down here has 3 objects. It's saying here's the length, and it's got 3 myObjects in there. And then we can actually dig down into these objects. So in an array, it has the index of each object, and that contains, or the index of each item in the list, and then the value, which is an object that we defined in this case. So we can dig into that and we can see, oh yeah, we put 200, 300 into that one. And then you can actually see the constructor. And then object B, also 200, 300, and object C. So, and then we can also make this bigger if we wanted to see all of that at the same time. So it's a pretty nice little console. You can dig into the info. So the way to work with this array, now that we've created it and filled it with objects, is you can access these objects with these indices. And it starts with 0 and goes up to the length -1. So if I was going to say my array, instead of logging the entire array, we can say length. If I play that, it's just going to give you the number 3. There's 3 things in it. And then if I wanted to get object B, remember it was showing the indices as 0, 1, and 2, so we can go square brackets after my array and put a 1 in there. And so I get the second object. And you can see we got object B. And again, if we do index 2, then we should get object C. And if we get 0, that's always the first one. That's object A. And of course, if you did try to get 3 in this one, it's going to be undefined. Undefined means there's just nothing put into the memory there. So you're going to want to capture that error, right? So if I was going to try and define something, let's say I have another object from array equals that on my array 3. Undefined also counts as a false Boolean if you evaluate it. So, if I do Boolean, and log the object from array, now I've got a false. So we can use that OR operator to say, hey, if I don't get an object here, I want to maybe throw an array, or throw an error. Throwing an error means we want an error to actually show up here, not just the value to keep going as if nothing was wrong. So that's saying, hey, we want something in this value, and if there isn't something in there, let us know before you start continuing along the code. And then you can just put a string in here and say, no value at object from array, or something like that. something descriptive that lets you know. And then we're going to do this, and then you can see that it throws that error. Oh, I guess it doesn't like, yeah, you can't throw it there. So what we can do is, instead of trying to do the OR statement, we can do a conditional. So a conditional is used with the if statement, just if, and then open parentheses. And then inside of these parentheses is where you put the test statement. If that statement is true, then it does the thing after the if. And if it's false, it skips that part of the code. So if I said false, and we'll say my array, object from array is equal to my array 0. So that'll be the object A right here, right? It's never going to do that because this is always false. And so we still have this undefined in here. Whereas if we put it to true, now it's that object A value. So this is pretty powerful because we can put more than just true or false in here. We can say if my array, or if we could say object from array, and we can test that value for truthiness, right? So if it's true, then we would change it. But actually we want it to be false, right? So if this is not something, then we want to make it something. That's kind of how it is. So, obviously it's kind of funny that we're just, putting in a bad value here, but you could think of an example of where the user is being able to select things or put in values. And so we want to be able to capture those errors and say, okay, if it's not that, then do something else. So in this case, we would capture that here and say, is that true? Is that an actual thing? If not, make it something, make it the first thing in that case. So actually, what we want to do is put that exclamation point there to say, if this is true, turn it to false for the purpose of this conditional. And so if it's false, turn it to true. And then when this is not a value, then we change it. And now we get the value. Cool. And then if I put this to 1, then we should get object B instead. So that's one way you can do it. There are times when you can try to get some data and it creates an error, right? So if I had let's say if I had that 3, right? And I was trying to get the name value from it, what happens is you get an error. Cannot read properties of undefined. Remember, my array 3 was undefined. And so there's no name inside of it to get. And so then it can't continue with the code. So there's another way to kind of do this kind of thing. And it's called a try catch. So you just type try, you put curly braces, and then the curly braces go around what you're doing with the try, what you want to do that might cause an error, and then you say catch, and you put the E for exception in there, and another set of curly braces. So the curly braces here might cause an exception or an error, and we're putting the letter E in there to stand for the error that gets passed out of that. And catch is saying, okay, if there was an error, we're going to run this catch function here, and that's going to do anything inside of these braces instead of throw the error. So then we can, say object array 0.name. And then we don't need this conditional anymore. Run this. And we see that we didn't get an error. We got object A name. Perfect. So that's how that works. And there's actually a final part of this called finally. In some cases, it can be helpful to put a finally in here. And this is just code that runs regardless of whether there was an error in this or not as part of this process. Typically, you don't generally need the finally. It's not super necessary because literally any code you put down here is going to run anyway. But I think it's if you tried to do this and there was an error, then this would run anyway. So yeah, I mean, you can nest try catches inside of each other as well. So I could put another try in here if we wanted to, but this is kind of getting a bit messy if you do that and hard to read. So try to limit the number of try catches nested inside of each other, at least visually within the code, because it can be real confusing. But it is actually a good idea to put try catches in your code, because the more errors that you catch, the more meaningful messages you can put in or fixes to whatever the values were, right? Generally, you want to have your code be as transparent as possible to say, hey, this is what's happening, and this is what we did to try and fix it, or this is why we couldn't proceed. Okay. I think we've gone quite deep into JavaScript's basic stuff. We've done objects, we've done arrays, we've even done a little bit of math, and I guess I didn't do the basic math stuff. You can do basic math. So like, if I wanted this H400, and I started with 100, I could then add 300 to it, just like this. And you remember with strings, when we were putting the plus symbol, that was putting the strings together. So this would be like the string 100 and the string 300 just joined together like this. But since they're both numbers, this actually gets added together as math. So it becomes 400. Similarly, if I wanted to multiply this 400 or this 100 by 4, I can use the star, the asterisk symbol, and the number to multiply by. And your usual order of operations, PEMDAS, does work here. You can also put parentheses around your math to make certain things go first. So like plus 100, and then you multiply by 2, right? That would still give you, 200 times 2, which is 400. And then otherwise, if you did it without those, you'd have 100 times 2, which is 200, plus 100, which is 300 instead. So you also have divide, which is with a forward slash there. So then you could have, this would be 300, so we want maybe 800, so it's 6, and then you can divide it by, well, yeah, divide by 2, but this is like 1 now, right? Or no, divided by 4, I don't remember what I made it, but yeah, you could do divide. There's also a few other ones. You can get the remainder from a division, so if I had like 100 divided by 12, then I would have the number come out of that, right? So let's do H. Don't need any of this anymore. So we get 8.3333. So there's some remainder here. So then what I can do, if I wanted to get the remainder, is put this division as the modulo symbol instead, which is the percent symbol. Now, I get 4 left over after I've divided 100 by 12. So I get 8 12s, and then 4 left over. 8 times 12, 96. Makes sense. And then there's also the exponential, like the power symbol, right? So you could square that by doing the caret symbol and the number, just 2. That'll make it, I think actually the order of operations is needed here as well. So let's put the parentheses around it. Is that how I would expect it to work? I don't think so. Got a 4. I would expect that to be 16. What if I did like 3? Interesting. I think maybe you have to do math power. Let's look at that real quick. The x to the power of y. So we did this, and then we want to put it to the square power. There we go. Now we got 16. So that's how that works. And then trying to think of anything else that we want to talk about real quick. There's more things you can do with arrays besides push to them. So, and also access them by index. So we can look at that. There we go. Lots of things. So I can join 2 arrays together with concat. So it'd just be like 2 things, right? So I have these 2 arrays. I would say first array concatenate on the second array. Or you can concatenate multiple arrays with just the commas. Pretty cool. Yeah, these other ones are good too. Slice and splice I always confuse together. So we'll look at those in a second. Join says, hey, I've got all of these and I want to turn them into a string, but I want to put something in between them. Maybe. You don't have to put something in between, but this will give you an array, and then if you join the array, script, document ID, text. Yeah, so it puts the commas into an array. That's why. So if we just put, if we wanted to not have the commas, you could put this empty string there, and then there's nothing in between them. Make them with spaces, or anything really. So this then becomes a string. It's no longer an array when you do that. So what you do is you take your array, that in this case fruits, and you do the join function and you assign that to a separate variable, and then you use that variable. And that way this fruits array does not get messed up. It doesn't get turned into a string. You could turn it into a string if you put fruits on this side. And now your array no longer exists. I think you can't do this because it's constant. There we go. That's something I didn't talk about. You can define a variable as a constant instead of a changeable variable. And in that case, it just will not allow you to change the value of fruits. And so then the code won't run if you try to change it. But yeah, now we see that fruits is actually the string instead of the array. And if I take this out, now we can see that is, you maybe can't tell that it's an array there, but it changed the commas. But we could do this. We could say length, because you can't get the, well, you could get the length of the string, but it would be it would be the number of characters in the string. In this case, we get 4 because there's 4 objects in the string, 4 items in the string that are each strings, so, or in the array that are each strings. And then if I took this out, you can see that length is much longer because it's each character in each of these strings plus our joiners. Okay, let's join. Then we also had length we've been using. All sorts of things in array that are very useful. Slice and splice. Splice is used to put things inside of the array or to remove certain items. So it says like here, the position, the index, how many to remove, which can be 0, and then the number of items, a list of items here that you can then splice into that position. So you can remove something and add other things at the same time with splice. Very powerful. And then slice is more of a get kind of thing. It's grabbing a section of the array. In this case, from 1, and then 3 items from 1. So I should give you this. Oh, I see. It's the positions. So it's from 1 to 3. Is that right? Start and end. End position. So if I put 1 and 1 in there, what does it give us? Doesn't give us anything. 1 and 2 will give us just the orange. If you took this out, if you just give it the 1, then it starts at 1 and gives you everything until the end. And so if I started at 2 and I put 1 in there, it doesn't give me anything. If I do 2 and 2, still get nothing. So you have, it's going to be the end position and not how many. So it doesn't give you this last one. 0, 1, 2, right? This is the 2 position right here. So I have to put 3 in there to say stop at 3, I guess. It's not the best, like this is not the easiest to consider as a way to do it, but it does work. And there's all sorts of things. You can reverse the order, you can run different functions on everything in the array. You can give the index of some value in the array. So I can look for apple and say where is apple, and it would give you 2, right? 0, 1, 2. There it is. So all sorts of cool stuff you can do with arrays. And I think that's where we stop. Thanks for hanging out. And next time we'll start doing some cool stuff with setup and draw, and we'll make this actually show some cool stuff. All right, later.